In early 2004, the farming town of Umalo sat on the quiet plains of Mpumalanga, South Africa. It was a place of endless roads, windmills, and sugar-colored dust that rose from the red earth when trucks passed. The people there lived simple lives: farmers, mechanics, school teachers, everyone knowing everyone else's business. That year, autumn came dry and late. The fields outside town grew brittle, the sky pale and hard, like glass stretched thin. It began with the discovery of a woman's body along the gravel road near a disused railway siding. The police at first thought it was a robbery gone wrong. Her purse was missing, her shoes gone, and the cause of death, a sharp trauma to the head, seemed ordinary enough for rural crime. But there was something odd about the scene. Her body had been washed, arranged, and covered with a torn piece of canvas. Whoever had done it had stayed long enough to clean her, to erase something. A week later, another woman was found in similar condition near a drainage ditch on the outskirts of town. She had also been washed. The cuts were precise, not frenzied, and the same kind of torn canvas had been draped across her chest. The local newspaper called it the Umalo murders. Locals had another name, the Hinterland Butcher. Police officers from nearby Middelburg joined the investigation. They formed a task force, which operated out of a small prefab building behind the station. 6 detectives, a map of the province pinned to the wall, red markers spreading outward from Umalo like infection. The victims were all women in their 20s or 30s, most of them transient workers, waitresses, hotel cleaners, and hitchhikers moving between towns. All were killed on the edges of the N11 highway. One of the detectives, Sergeant McCona, began comparing reports from other provinces. He noticed a similar pattern stretching back to 2002. Unidentified female victims found near railway lines or sugarcane fields. Always washed, always covered with something. A blanket, a coat, a piece of plastic sheeting. It wasn't ritualistic, not in any obvious way. It was careful, intimate. When they finally caught their first real lead, it came from a truck stop outside Folksrust. A waitress remembered a man who drove an old Nissan Baccy with a homemade canopy. He wore a faded blue mechanic's uniform, no company logo, and kept his hair very short. He was polite, almost shy. He liked to sit at the far end of the counter where he could watch the road. He always ordered the same meal: eggs, white toast, and black coffee. A composite sketch was made, distributed to nearby police stations, and aired once on national television. 2 days later, another body appeared. This time, she hadn't been found by accident. A local farmer noticed drag marks in the dust near his fence line, following them until he found a small pile of disturbed soil beneath an acacia tree. The body had been buried shallowly, covered with lime. The soil was still fresh. Tire impressions led away from the site toward the road, and one of them, unusually, had a missing tread segment, a thin, irregular mark that investigators photographed carefully. Police began roadblocks on the N11 and surrounding routes, stopping trucks and utility vehicles for inspection. On the morning of May 6th, they found what they were looking for. A pale green Nissan Baccy, canopy dented, was pulled over near Amersfoort. Behind the wheel was a 37-year-old man named Johannes Petrus Leroux. He carried no identification at first, only a work permit from a defunct auto garage in Witbank. The rear of his truck was lined with plastic sheeting and smelled faintly of bleach. Under the passenger seat, officers found a long-handled cleaver with a cracked wooden grip. Leroux was arrested without resistance. He spoke softly, nodded when asked questions, and didn't try to run. When they searched his small, rented room on the edge of town, they found a set of notebooks. Each entry contained dates, place names, and initials, some matching the known victims. The handwriting was small and neat, every letter exact. At the top of the first page, he'd written, "When they are clean, they are quiet." In the weeks that followed, he confessed to 7 murders. The confessions came slowly, often interrupted by long pauses, as though he were reconstructing something he couldn't quite see. He told detectives that he had worked as a mechanic for many years, moving between farms and small towns. He said he preferred the roads at night, when everything was clear. When asked why he washed the bodies, he said he didn't like to leave them messy. There was no clear motive. He hadn't robbed them. He didn't appear driven by sexual compulsion or anger. It was something else, a kind of need for order, a fixation with cleanliness that investigators later described as obsessive. The press called him the Hinterland Butcher for months before his real name was released. Reporters filled columns with speculation. Was he a failed mortician? A religious fanatic? A drifter haunted by something from his childhood? None of those theories matched the quiet man who sat in the dock during trial, his hands folded neatly in front of him, eyes down. During psychiatric evaluation, he spoke about his father, a slaughterhouse worker in Newcastle. As a boy, he'd been made to help clean tools after the daily butchering, scrubbing blood from knives and floor drains, wiping down tables until they shone. He said the smell never left, even when everything looked clean. The trial began in late 2005. Each witness described the same man, polite, soft-spoken, always willing to help. He'd lived among them for years without suspicion. One woman from his neighborhood recalled how he often swept the gravel outside his door in the evenings, even when it was spotless. The defense argued diminished responsibility, citing obsessive-compulsive disorder and childhood trauma. The prosecution countered with precision. Every murder premeditated, every movement deliberate. The cleaver, the plastic sheets, the burial sites, all planned. After 4 weeks, the court found Johannes Leroux guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. He never appealed. In the years since, the case faded from public view. The stretch of road between Amalo and Amersfoort is still long and flat, lined with thorn trees and dry grass. Truckers still stop at the same roadside cafes. At one of them, the waitress who gave the original description still works weekends. She doesn't talk about that time anymore, except to mention that she can't stand the smell of bleach. The field where the last body was found has since been plowed over, the acacia tree long gone. But sometimes, after rain, the soil there still turns a faint, pale color, chalky, unnatural, as though something beneath it refuses to fade. In the summer of 1990, Gainesville, Florida, was a college town preparing for the start of a new semester. The air was thick with heat, the kind that never really lifted, and the streets around the University of Florida were filled with moving vans, secondhand furniture, and students saying goodbyes in the parking lots of small apartment complexes. By the third week of August, the town was full again. Bars reopening, bookstores stacking up required texts, everything settling into the rhythm of late summer. On Friday, August 24th, a 19-year-old student named Sonia Larson returned to her apartment at Williamsburg Village with her roommate, Christina Powell. They were new to Gainesville, still adjusting to living on their own. They ordered food, unpacked a few boxes, and went to bed early. The next day, neither of them showed up for class registration. When friends couldn't reach them, police were called to do a welfare check. Inside the small apartment, they found both women murdered. There was almost no sign of forced entry. The crime scene was quiet, methodical, and deeply unsettling in its precision. Before the department could even process what they'd seen, another call came in the following day. Less than 2 miles away, another woman, Krista Hoyt, age 17, had been killed in her apartment. The similarities were immediate. The same kind of wounds, the same deliberate arrangement of the victims afterward, and the same eerie lack of fingerprints or noise reported by neighbors. Gainesville's police chief called an emergency meeting that night. The media didn't have much to go on, only that the attacks were brutal and appeared connected. But Gainesville was small, and rumors spread faster than press releases. Within 48 hours, the University of Florida campus went into a kind of quiet lockdown. Students stayed in groups, slept in shifts, and taped kitchen knives to their dorm doors. Gun shops sold out of everything in stock. Then came the 4th and 5th murders. On August 27th, roommates Tracy Poles and Manny Tabawada were attacked inside their apartment at Gatorwood. Both were found dead in their bedrooms. The door had been locked. The killer had forced his way in. Manny had fought back. Police found defensive wounds, signs of a struggle, but it hadn't mattered. The same signature, the same control, the same methodical precision marked the scene. By now, the Gainesville Ripper, as newspapers began calling him, had turned the college town into a place of collective paranoia. The usual Florida soundtrack, crickets, cicadas, the buzz of ceiling fans, was replaced by sirens, helicopters, and the dull clatter of window locks being installed. Students left the city in waves. By the end of August, roughly a third of the University of Florida population had temporarily moved back home. The police formed a joint task force with state and federal investigators. Their first suspect was a local man named Edward Humphrey, a student with a history of erratic behavior and a scarred face that the press fixated on. He'd been seen near one of the apartment complexes and was soon arrested for assault in an unrelated case. For nearly 2 weeks, Gainesville believed the killer had been caught. But the killings had already stopped before Humphrey's arrest, and something about the scenes didn't add up. The killer had left no trace of panic or impulse. Everything about the attacks was deliberate. The crime scene spoke of patience, not frenzy. Meanwhile, a few hours north, in Ocala, another story was unfolding inside a Florida state prison. There, a 36-year-old drifter named Danny Rolling was serving time for a string of armed robberies. He'd grown up in Shreveport, Louisiana, and had a long record of violence, assaults, burglaries, domestic incidents that rarely made it beyond small-town reports. He had spent years drifting across the South, sleeping in campsites, stealing from stores, living on the margins. When police traced DNA and evidence from the Gainesville scenes, seminal samples, blood type, fibers, they found a match to Rolling. He had been living in the woods near the university at the time of the murders, camping under a thick canopy of trees just beyond Archer Road. Investigators found a small campsite there, a blanket, a pair of gloves, a screwdriver, a cassette player, and audio tapes of him singing country songs and confessing to crimes in a low, calm voice. Rolling had broken into apartments through sliding glass doors, sometimes prying them open with a screwdriver, sometimes entering through unlocked patios. He moved silently, often waiting for victims to fall asleep. The attacks were short, controlled, and ritualistic in a way that disturbed even the seasoned investigators. When Rolling's DNA confirmed the match in 1991, the details became clear. Before Gainesville, he had murdered a family of 3 in Shreveport, Tom, Julie, and their 8-year-old son, Sean Grissom, under strikingly similar circumstances. After that, he fled Louisiana and began moving through Florida, stealing cars, robbing banks, hiding in the woods. Gainesville had simply been where he stopped. During his confession tapes, Rolling referred to an alternate personality named Gemini. He described himself as guided by something external, something he didn't fully understand. He said the murders had been meant to cleanse. Investigators debated whether this was manipulation or genuine delusion, but the tapes had the same quality that had defined his crimes: soft-spoken, calm, disturbingly composed. He was charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. The trial took place in 1994, and he pleaded guilty before it could go to jury deliberation. He didn't fight the sentence. His demeanor remained steady even when the verdict was read. In his final statement before execution, Rolling recited a hymn and then a short poem. He made no direct apology. Witnesses described his tone as oddly serene. Outside the prison that night, hundreds of people gathered in vigil, some holding candles, others carrying signs. It was one of those Florida nights where the air doesn't move, and the sound of cicadas is so constant it feels like part of the silence. When the official announcement came, Danny Rolling executed by lethal injection, the city of Gainesville didn't celebrate exactly. It just exhaled. The apartments where the murders took place have all since been remodeled or replaced. Williamsburg Village is gone. The area near Archer Road, where Rolling camped, has been developed into housing and stores. For years, students who moved into Gainesville that August told stories about why they kept their windows locked or why there were so many motion lights along certain streets. Few remember the sound of Rolling's voice on those tapes. He spoke like someone describing the weather, narrating what had already happened and could not be undone. There were 5 graves in Gainesville that summer and one man's campsite in the trees. Nothing more was ever found there. Mumbai, 2003. The monsoon had just ended, leaving the streets slick with oil and rainwater. The city smelled of rust, damp concrete, and the faint sweetness of burning incense. Vendors were reopening their stalls, buses clattered down Unnerving's narrow lanes, and in the low neighborhoods near Juhu Beach, the power flickered each night like a nervous pulse. It was in this uneasy quiet that people began seeing him, a man in a clown mask, standing near the edge of the streetlights. At first, the reports came from children. A clown near the railway footbridge. A clown sitting on a bench outside the market after midnight. The police brushed it off. A prank, a costume, someone trying to frighten kids. Mumbai had bigger problems: gang violence, disappearances, slum fires. But within 2 weeks, the stories changed. The clown wasn't just being seen. He was being found near the homes of women who had gone missing. The first was a young nurse named Rekha Shah. She lived in a one-room flat above a tailor's shop in Santa Cruz. On the night of September 18th, she called her mother to say she'd be home late. The next morning, her door was found open, her bag still on the table. There was no sign of forced entry, only a smear of red grease paint on the inside of the doorknob. Her body turned up 3 days later in a drainage canal behind the airport. The face was painted crudely with white powder and red lipstick. The press called it the clown murder. At first, the police kept the details quiet, but Mumbai's tabloids didn't need help inventing a story. Within a week, vendors were selling cheap clown masks in the markets. Some wore them for fun. Others avoided the streets altogether. Then another woman disappeared, a college student named Kavita Menon. She was last seen leaving a dance rehearsal near Bandra. Her friend said she'd mentioned a funny-looking man who'd been watching her from a motorbike across the street. 2 nights later, her body was found in a vacant apartment complex. Her clothes were neatly folded beside her. Her face was painted white. Detectives began connecting the cases through the forensic details. Both victims had been injected with a veterinary-grade anesthetic, ketamine, common in animal clinics. There was no sign of sexual assault, no theft. The positioning of the bodies was deliberate, ritualistic almost, lying flat, hands clasped like mannequins. Police canvassed every veterinary supplier in the city. One name appeared repeatedly on receipts for small but regular purchases: a man named Rajiv Patil, a freelance animal handler who occasionally worked for film sets. He had a small workshop in Goregaon, near the industrial district where old circus equipment was stored. When detectives visited, Patil wasn't home, but his neighbors mentioned something odd: a large costume rack visible through his window, filled with old carnival clothing and painted masks. He'd once worked for a traveling circus that had folded in the late 1990s. He kept the props, saying he might open a children's entertainment business one day. The police entered the flat the next morning with a warrant. The smell inside was sharp, disinfectant, oil, and something chemical. In the corner was a rack of costumes: faded clown suits, painted wigs, oversized shoes. On the wall hung several masks, each one slightly different. Some were cracked from use. Others were freshly painted. In the sink, investigators found glass vials labeled ketamine hydrochloride. On the table, an old photo, a black and white print showing a small circus tent and a group of performers in clown makeup. One of them, smiling in the center, was Rajiv. He was arrested that night at a bus terminal near Thane. He didn't resist. In fact, he smiled when the officers recognized him. During questioning, he spoke softly, politely. He said the women were chosen because they looked sad. He claimed he wanted to make them beautiful, to turn them into perfect smiles. His words were not theatrical. They were calm, steady, almost childlike. Patil had kept journals, thin notebooks filled with sketches of faces in clown makeup, notes about color tones and facial symmetry. Each page corresponded to one of the victims. Forensic teams recovered evidence tying him to at least 4 murders. But there were other cases, unsolved disappearances of women from the suburbs of Mumbai between 1999 and 2002. Some fit the same pattern. The total count, by police estimates, could have been as high as 12. The press named him the Mumbai Clown. In court, Patil refused to speak. He stood quietly in his wrinkled prison uniform, hands clasped, head slightly tilted. When asked why he painted their faces, he replied only once: because they stopped smiling. The trial was short. The evidence was overwhelming: DNA, witness accounts, the anesthetic vials. He was convicted on 4 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison. But the story didn't end there. In 2005, during his incarceration at Arthur Road Jail, 2 inmates reported hearing strange sounds at night: soft laughter, rhythmic tapping, like someone bouncing a rubber ball in his cell. Guards ignored it until one morning when Patil was found dead, hanging from a bedsheet tied to the ceiling vent. On his body, they found traces of white chalk smeared across his mouth and fingertips. There were no chalks or cosmetics in his cell. The jail's internal report listed the cause as suicide. The makeup, they said, must have been transferred accidentally from another inmate's materials used in theater therapy. But there was no record of anyone possessing such items. After his death, the killings stopped completely. But every year, around late September, the police station in Bandra still receives a few calls, usually from night watchmen or late-shift taxi drivers. A man in a clown mask, they say, walking near the old film studios, just outside the reach of the light. Never speaking, never moving when they call out. And when they approach, he's gone. The rain starts again. The streets fill with reflections. And the city, loud, endless, sleepless, keeps going as if nothing happened. In the winter of 2002, the fishing town of Volendam looked almost unchanged from a century earlier. Narrow brick houses leaned slightly toward the canals, their roofs slick with frost, and the harbor smelled of salt, diesel, and cold smoke from the fish stalls. It was the kind of place that seemed too small, too orderly for the kind of violence that later came to define it. The house stood at the edge of the old town, a narrow 3-story building on Julianog, not far from the water. It belonged to the Van der Meer family: parents, 2 children, and a grandmother who lived on the top floor. The father, Peter, ran a small repair shop near the docks. The mother, Anna, worked part-time in a bakery. They were known as quiet, polite, the kind of people who nodded to neighbors and kept their windows clean. On the night of February 16th, the lights in the house went out around 10:30. The street outside was still alive. Volendam had a nightlife that drew young people from nearby towns. But the Van der Meer home was dark, curtains drawn, no sign of movement. The following morning, the neighbor across the canal noticed something odd. The back door stood slightly open, moving in the wind. She assumed Peter had gone out early for work, until she saw the van still parked outside. By noon, she called the police. 2 officers arrived at 12:47 p.m. They entered through the back door. What they found inside didn't look like a robbery. Nothing had been stolen, no drawers emptied. But the scene was methodical, deliberate, almost staged. All 4 members of the family were dead. 3 upstairs, 1 on the ground floor. Each had been struck multiple times with what appeared to be an axe or similar heavy tool. The rooms were tidy. Chairs were pushed in, dishes stacked neatly by the sink. The only sign of disruption was the blood, and even that had been partially cleaned, as though the killer had taken time afterward to wipe certain surfaces. When the forensic team arrived, they found no fingerprints, no footprints, no trace of forced entry. The only physical clue was a faint smudge on the inside handle of the back door, a mark consistent with a gloved hand that had briefly touched the frame. For weeks, police tried to reconstruct what had happened that night. They found no enemies, no debts, no family disputes. The Van der Meers were, by every account, ordinary. The only anomaly came from a small convenience store security camera 2 streets away. At 9:56 p.m. on the night of the murders, it recorded a figure walking past in a heavy coat and rubber fisherman's boots, carrying what looked like a toolbox. The person never looked toward the camera. The footage was grainy, and the face was obscured by a knit cap. As investigators widened their search, they began hearing rumors about a man who had worked at the harbor years before, known only as De Visser, the fisherman. He had done odd jobs, repairing nets and sharpening knives, but had disappeared after a series of disputes with other workers. Some said he'd lived on a boat for a time, others that he'd gone inland, working as a butcher. None of it was confirmed. Then, in April, a break came unexpectedly. A fisherman dredging near Edam pulled up something heavy tangled in his nets. It was a waterproof canvas bag tied with wire. Inside were blood-stained clothes, a jacket, gloves, and a torn apron. The DNA matched the victims, but there were also traces of another person, male, unidentified. The bag had been in the water for weeks. The fibers were swollen, the stains faded, but one detail stood out. On the jacket's inside pocket was a patch with a company name almost worn away. Van Tesselve Leeshandel, Permanent. A butcher's supplier, less than 20 kilometers away. Detectives visited the facility. Most employees were long-term workers, men in their 40s and 50s who had been there for years. But one name stood out from the records: Adrian Kurtz, a part-time employee who had stopped showing up in early February. His address was listed as a rented caravan near Oosthuizen. When police arrived, the caravan was empty. The door was unlocked. Inside, they found tools, cleaning supplies, and a copy of the Telegraph newspaper dated February 17th, the morning after the murders. On the table was a half-finished letter written in cramped, neat handwriting. They always talked about the smell. I told them it never leaves. It goes into the hands, into the skin. I tried to wash it away. Kurtz was nowhere to be found. Over the next 2 months, sightings came in from all over the province. Men who looked like him, moving through small towns, sleeping rough, picking up short labor shifts. None were confirmed. By summer, the case began to stall. The Vandermeer house was sealed, the furniture removed, the curtains still drawn. Locals avoided walking past it at night. Then, in August, hikers near the Markermeer shore found a skull and a set of bones scattered along the rocks. The remains were later identified as belonging to Kurtz. He had died from a single gunshot wound to the head. The weapon was never found. Forensic analysis of the bones suggested they'd been exposed to water and sun for several months, likely since March. It was consistent with a suicide, but no note was found, and the weapon's absence left the conclusion uncertain. After his identification, police matched Kurtz's DNA to the samples on the clothing in the dredged bag. They believed he had acted alone, but why he had chosen the Vandermeer family was never determined. There was no known connection between them, no financial link, no personal contact. The working theory was that he had delivered meat or equipment to their neighborhood and fixated on the family for reasons unknown. Some investigators thought he might have entered the house at random, others that he had mistaken it for another address. But there was nothing certain. The house was demolished in 2005. A small townhouse now stands there, painted pale yellow, with no plaque or marker to indicate what once happened. Locals still remember, though. They talk about how the police lights reflected off the frozen canal that morning, how quiet the street became afterward. In the archives of the Dutch Forensic Institute, the case file is still labeled Volendam, 2002, family homicide, cleaver/axe, probable lone actor. The last note in the file is brief. No remaining suspects. Case considered closed, pending further evidence. Motive unknown. On the anniversary of the murders, someone still leaves flowers at the canal bridge. No one knows who. In a town that measures itself by tides and seasons, some things simply don't wash away. Osaka, 1979. The neighborhood of Sumiyoshi was a quiet residential area, tucked between narrow lanes and rice wholesalers' warehouses. Families kept their doors open during the day. The air smelled of soy and sea salt from the nearby bay. But that autumn, the peace broke with a scream that still hangs in Japanese true crime history like a bruise. It began on the night of October 7th, 1979. The Nakamura family, Father Hiroshi, Mother Eiko, their teenage daughter Aki, and young son Kenji, lived in a 2-story house near the edge of the district. Neighbors later said they heard what sounded like furniture crashing, then a single, sharp scream around 10:30 p.m. By the time police arrived, summoned by a terrified passerby, the house was silent again. What they found inside would mark one of the most shocking cases in post-war Japan. The lights were still on. The front door was locked from the inside. No sign of forced entry. But the living room looked like a storm had passed through. Tables overturned, drawers ripped open, walls smeared with blood. In the center of the tatami floor lay Hiroshi Nakamura, his skull caved in. Near him, an axe, its wooden handle slick with blood. Upstairs, officers found Eiko slumped against the wall, her hand still clutching her daughter's sleeve. Both were dead, struck with the same weapon. In the boy's room, Kenji lay on the futon, as if asleep, his face peaceful but pale. He'd been suffocated with a pillow. The family dog was found locked in the bathroom, barking hysterically. It looked like a family annihilation, a father killing his wife and children before taking his own life. But there was no sign Hiroshi had done so. He had no self-inflicted wounds. The axe had been dropped several meters away, and forensic analysis later showed two distinct sets of prints, one his, one belonging to an unknown second person. At first, investigators suspected robbery, but nothing was missing. Not money, not jewelry. Even Aiko's purse lay untouched on the counter. The killer had entered quietly, struck with precision, and vanished. Then came the next night. Less than 24 hours after the Nakamura murders, another family, the Hayashis just 5 blocks away, were found dead in their home. This time, the weapon was the same, a hatchet. The injuries matched almost exactly. The father struck first, then the wife, then the children. The crime scene was arranged, curtains drawn, front door locked from inside, lights still burning. Panic spread through Osaka. Newspapers called the unknown killer Kama no Kamanin, the axe-masked man. By the end of that week, 3 more homes were struck in similar fashion. In total, 12 victims, all families, all middle class, all living within a 2-kilometer radius. The police deployed hundreds of officers, but there were no fingerprints, no witnesses. Patrols doubled in size, curfews were set, and still the murders continued. Each occurred on a Saturday night, between 10 and 11 p.m. The sound of rain reported almost every time. It wasn't until the 5th killing that a survivor was found. In the small house of the Sugimoto family, the youngest daughter, 8-year-old Nami, had hidden under the floorboards after hearing shouting. When the officers found her hours later, shaking and covered in dust, she could only say one thing. He wore a mask, like an old man's face, but it moved. Investigators didn't understand what she meant until they examined a smudge of something near the window frame, traces of latex and human sweat. The following week, police found a discarded mask in a drainage canal near one of the crime scenes, a rubber festival mask shaped like a bald old man's head, with exaggerated wrinkles and a fixed grin. The manufacturer said it was sold as part of a festival costume the previous year. The newspapers erupted. The Osaka Axe family case, as it came to be called, had officially become the work of a serial murderer. But then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. After October 28th, no new attacks occurred. Patrols remained in place for months. Nothing. The case went cold. 2 years later, in 1981, a railway worker in Kobe discovered a blood-stained shirt stuffed into a locker at the train station. Inside the pocket, a folded note written in neat, childish hiragana. They smiled too much. I wanted them to sleep. They won't be lonely now. DNA from the blood matched 2 of the victims from the Nakamura house. But by then, the trail was stone cold. The case remains unsolved to this day. Theories abound that the killer was a disgraced factory worker from a nearby steel plant, that it was a religious cult member punishing happy families, or even a police cover-up involving an off-duty officer. But among locals, another rumor persists. In the years after, some residents claimed to see a man walking the streets of Sumiyoshi at night, tall, in a gray raincoat, face obscured by what looked like a rubber mask. He never spoke, never reacted when approached. One woman swore that when she looked closely under the flickering light, the mask wasn't latex at all. It was skin. Every October, rain falls hard on Osaka's southern streets. People still shut their windows tight, drawing the curtains before 10 p.m. just in case. Because no one ever found the axe, and no one ever proved he was gone. Liskeard, a small market town in Cornwall, sits high on a hill surrounded by mist and moorland. By day, it looks almost untouched by time. Stone cottages, narrow lanes, church bells echoing over slate rooftops. But at night, when the fog drifts in from Bodmin Moor, the town becomes something else entirely. In 2010, people started locking their doors earlier. It began as rumor. A few locals claimed to have seen a man walking the streets after dark, wearing a clown mask and carrying a small case. At first, everyone assumed it was a prank, something for Halloween, or an attempt to stir up fear in a place too quiet for real crime. Teenagers drove around the back roads hoping to catch a glimpse, taking photos of every shadow and streetlight. But by November, the laughter stopped. The first death came on the 9th. A retired postman named Harold Finn was found in his kitchen just after dawn. His front door was unlocked, his groceries still on the counter. He had been struck repeatedly in the head with what police later described as a blunt, flat-edged tool. On the kitchen table, officers found something out of place, a red balloon tied to the handle of a teacup. 2 nights later, a woman was attacked in her home across town. She survived, but barely. Her statement was short and confused. She said she'd woken up to see someone standing at the end of her bed wearing a white mask with red circles on the cheeks. The person hadn't spoken. When she screamed, he hit her once, hard, and ran. She said the mask glinted in the dark like porcelain. By the time the story made national news, the press had already named him the Liscard Clown. Local police, unprepared for that kind of attention, began nightly patrols. Officers drove slowly through the fogged streets, spotlights sweeping across the empty roads. The problem was there were no patterns, no fingerprints, no forced entry, and no one who could describe the attacker beyond a clown mask and gloves. The third victim, a shopkeeper named Margaret Brown, lived above her corner store on Dean Street. She'd locked up around 9 that night. At 11:45, a neighbor heard what sounded like a cupboard falling over. When police arrived, they found her lying near the top of the stairs. Again, a red balloon was tied to the railing beside her. The entire town began sleeping in shifts. People left lights on, kept dogs in the house, and taped sheets of newspaper over their windows. It didn't matter. The clown seemed to know who lived alone, who forgot to latch the back door. After the third attack, a team from Devon and Cornwall Police Headquarters joined the investigation. They combed through CCTV footage from gas stations, supermarkets, and bus depots. Liscard didn't have many cameras, but one positioned near the roundabout at the edge of town caught something. At 3:12 a.m., a small hatchback passing slowly, its license plate obscured with tape. Through the windshield, a faint reflection, a white mask with a red smear across it. The footage was too blurry for identification, but it gave the officers a timeline. The car had driven in from A38 and left again less than 15 minutes later, heading toward Bodmin. Roadblocks were set up. Days passed without incident, then a week. People began to relax, thinking perhaps it had all been some deranged traveler passing through. On November 26th, that illusion ended. A farmer discovered a burnout hatchback on an old service road outside St. Clear, about 6 miles from town. Inside was a melted clown mask, a pair of gloves, and something else, what appeared to be a dented hammer, scorched but intact. Nearby, a shallow grave contained human remains, wrapped in tarpaulin. Forensic analysis confirmed they belonged to a man in his 40s, later identified as Anthony Pierce, a carnival handyman who'd been missing for 2 months. Pierce had been known locally. He worked seasonally with traveling fairs, setting up rides, repairing generators, and occasionally performing as a clown for children's events. He was last seen in late September, just before the sightings began. Detectives pieced together his movements. He arrived in Liscard with a small fairground crew, staying in a rented caravan behind a pub on Station Road. When the fair moved on, Pierce stayed behind, claiming to have found new work. What he actually found was something else. When police searched his caravan, they discovered notebooks filled with sketches, faces painted white with exaggerated red grins, drawings of houses, maps of town streets. Some pages contained only numbers and times. At first glance, they looked like performance notes, but investigators later realized they corresponded to nights of the attacks. The notebooks ended abruptly on November 14th. The last line read, "I know he's here. He's not finished." Theories began to split. Some believed Pierce was the killer and had taken his own life after realizing what he'd done. Others thought he had an accomplice, or that someone had turned on him. The handwriting in the notebook changed halfway through, growing erratic, slanted. Experts later debated whether it was a sign of psychosis or simply exhaustion. The police never publicly stated whether they believed Pierce acted alone. His DNA matched the gloves found in the burnt car, but partial prints on the hammer suggested a second person. That individual was never identified. After the discovery, the attack stopped. No more balloons. No more masked sightings. Liskeard returned to its old quiet rhythm by winter, but something in the town had shifted. People left their curtains closed. The fog that rolled in from the moor felt heavier, the streets too still. The house on Dean Street, where Margaret Brown had died, remained vacant for years. Even now, locals say the faint sound of a rubber balloon rubbing against plaster can sometimes be heard on cold nights, like static in the walls. Officially, the Liskeard clown case was marked unsolved, likely deceased suspect. But the files remain open. Every few years, when the fog thickens early and balloons begin to appear at the autumn fair, someone inevitably calls the police. They always come. They always find nothing. London, winter of 1804. The district of Hammersmith lay on the edge of the city, a quiet parish of narrow lanes, half-frozen canals, and fields veiled in fog. By January, the streets were nearly deserted after dark. People said there was something out there, something that glowed faintly white in the mist. They called it the Hammersmith ghost. For months, residents swore they'd seen a pale figure drifting through the churchyard and alleys near Beaver Lane. Some said it wore a shroud. Others described hollow eyes, the face of a man long dead. A brewer returning home late one night claimed it had seized him by the throat. A pregnant woman saw it rising from behind a gravestone and collapsed from shock. She died 2 days later. London newspapers printed every rumor, and within weeks, the parish was seized by panic. Groups of men began patrolling after dark with clubs and pistols, hoping to catch the ghost. They were ordinary tradesmen, watchmen, cobblers, apprentices, but the fear in the district had grown into something close to hysteria. On the night of January 3rd, one of those men, Francis Smith, a 29-year-old excise officer, loaded his flintlock and set out alone. He was determined to end the haunting once and for all. At around 11 o'clock, near Black Lion Lane, he heard footsteps through the frost. Out of the fog came a tall white shape, faintly glimmering in the moonlight. Smith shouted, "Who goes there?" The figure didn't answer. He shouted again, louder this time, "Speak, or I'll fire." No reply. Smith raised his gun and fired once. The shot cracked through the still air. The figure fell instantly. When Smith approached, he realized what he had done. It wasn't a ghost. It was a man, Thomas Millwood, a local bricklayer who had been walking home from his sister's house. He wore his work clothes, white linen trousers, a white flannel waistcoat, and a white apron, bright garments that caught the moonlight and, from a distance, could have looked spectral. He died where he fell. When the patrolman found Smith moments later, he was still shaking. "I thought it was him," he kept saying. "The ghost. I thought it was the ghost." The following morning, the coroner's jury returned a verdict of willful murder. The case drew enormous crowds. For the first time in British history, the word ghost appeared as a cause of fatal error in a murder trial. At the Old Bailey, witnesses confirmed that Millwood had been mistaken for the apparition before. One neighbor told the court that his wife had warned him only days earlier, "Don't go out in your white clothes. They'll shoot you for a spirit." Smith's defense argued that he had fired under genuine terror, convinced he was confronting something supernatural. The judge refused to accept that as justification. The jury deliberated for less than an hour and returned a verdict of manslaughter, but the judge overruled it. Smith was sentenced to death. Public outcry followed. Thousands petitioned for clemency, claiming Smith had acted not out of malice but fear. A week later, King George III granted a royal pardon, commuting the sentence to 1 year of hard labor. The haunting, meanwhile, stopped, but the story wasn't finished. Later that year, a man named John Graham, a shoemaker living nearby, came forward and confessed. He admitted he'd been dressing up in a white sheet to scare his apprentices, who had been telling ghost stories instead of working. He claimed he never intended to frighten the neighborhood, and certainly not to provoke bloodshed. No charges were ever filed against him. Yet the sightings had begun months before Graham's prank. Some locals still insisted they'd seen something that wasn't human, tall, silent, and radiant. One constable swore he saw it vanish into a wall of fog. Others said it was the restless spirit of a suicide buried in the churchyard. A man denied holy ground. After the shooting, the ghost was never seen again. But strange stories lingered for years around St. Paul's churchyard. Gardeners spoke of cold spots that never thawed. Children claimed to hear weeping from the tombs at night. And some nights, when the mist rolled in from the river, people said you could still glimpse a white shape drifting between the graves, slow, uncertain, as if searching for something it could never find. What the court called an accident, the parish called a haunting that turned real. And long after Francis Smith finished his year of labor, he refused to walk through Hammersmith after dark. He said the fog was never empty again. Northern Finland in the 1960s was quiet country. Long winters, dark forests, towns stitched together by frozen lakes and narrow roads. Oulu, the largest city in the north, was little more than a collection of wooden houses and industrial yards back then. It was the kind of place where the night could stretch on forever, and people disappeared without anyone noticing until spring thaw. The first killing went almost unnoticed. In December of 1962, a trapper named Matti Jarvinen found a half-buried body near the edge of the Senginjoki forest, about 10 kilometers east of Oulu. The man had been killed with a single blow from an axe, clean, precise, through the base of the skull. The snow had preserved everything. His clothes were stiff with frost, his eyes open. Police initially believed it was an accident, maybe a drunken quarrel between woodcutters. But there was no sign of struggle, no missing tools, and no tracks leading away except for a single, narrow set of footprints that ended abruptly in the woods. The case file was opened and left cold within weeks. 3 months later, another man vanished. He was a fisherman from Hailuoto who'd come into Oulu for supplies. His boat was later found drifting under the frozen bridge at Tuira, the engine still running. His body appeared days later on the riverbank. Same wound, same precision. The papers called it the work of an axe, but police didn't say much at all. By spring, the town began to whisper about Metsämies the woodsman. At first, it was just rumor. A faceless man seen walking the logging roads after midnight, carrying a wrapped bundle over his shoulder. Truck drivers said they'd seen him standing beside the tree line, unmoving as their headlights passed. No one could describe his face. Some said he wore an old army coat. Others claimed it was a reindeer hide jacket with blood stains on the sleeves. In July 1963, 2 boys camping near the Paikosjärvi Lake found a human skull. The remains were later identified as a vagrant who'd gone missing the previous winter. He, too, had been struck once at the base of the skull with something heavy and sharp-edged. Police began quietly searching for patterns. All victims were men, all killed outdoors, all in or around the pine forests east of town. They never found footprints leading in or out. In November of that same year, a lumberjack named Arto Niemi reported seeing a man standing near his campfire one night. The stranger didn't speak. He just stared, motionless, until Arto reached for his rifle. Then the man turned and walked into the dark, his boots making no sound on the frozen ground. Arto described him as tall, wearing a tattered coat and a hood pulled low over his face. He said the man's hands were too clean for someone living in the woods. By 1964, 5 men were dead. That winter, a local paper, Kaleva, ran a headline that finally named it, "Axe Killer Stalks Oulu Forests." The term stuck. Patrols were sent out. Logging roads were watched. But in the cold months, when daylight was only a few hours long, even the police hesitated to enter the trees after dusk. There was a sense that the killer knew the woods too well, the streams that froze solid, the ditches that held snow deep enough to swallow tracks. Each killing was quiet, quick, efficient. He never left fingerprints and never took anything from the bodies. In February 1965, the killings stopped as suddenly as they had begun. Then, 2 years later, the woods gave up something. During the thaw of 1967, a forestry team found a rusted axe head embedded in a tree near the Senginjoki stream. The handle had long since rotted away, but the metal bore faint traces of what looked like blood. Forensic testing was primitive at the time, but the sample matched the blood type of 2 of the known victims. The axe was military issue, used by Finnish soldiers during the Continuation War 2 decades earlier. That detail led investigators to the local Veterans Registry. Dozens of men had returned to Oulu after the war and lived quietly in the surrounding villages. Some had served in forest units. Rangers trained to survive alone for months in sub-zero wilderness. One name stood out, Eino Lantonen. Lantonen had lived near the Sengenjoki forest until his disappearance in late 1962, just before the first killing. His cabin had been found abandoned, a week's worth of food still on the table, axe missing from a wall. His neighbors said he'd grown increasingly strange in the years before, muttering about people in the trees, carving marks into his door frames. When police reopened his file, they found something else. A hunter's logbook recovered from the cabin listed dates and notes written in pencil. 15.12 First snow. Tracks seen. 19.12 Two visitors by the stream. 21.12 Silence tonight. The entries ended that winter. It's possible Lantonen died in the woods that same month, perhaps overcome by the cold or his own delusions. But the killings that followed over the next 2 years suggested otherwise. Some investigators believed he had become feral, living off trapped animals, hunting anyone who entered what he saw as his territory. Others thought someone had found his axe, and the legend carried on through imitation. In 1971, a skull was found deep in the forest, inside what appeared to be a collapsed shelter. The jawbone had a gold tooth, matching Lantonen's old Army dental records. Near it lay scraps of decayed cloth and a rusted pocket knife. The official report concluded that he had died of exposure sometime in the mid-1960s. But the killings didn't end there. In 1974, almost a decade after the last confirmed murder, a hiker was found dead near the same woods. The same wound, same precision. The case was reopened briefly, then closed again for lack of evidence. Investigators argued whether it was coincidence or a copycat, but those who'd worked the original files refused to discuss it publicly. Over the years, the story of the Oulu Woods axe killer drifted into folklore. Locals still refer to a certain patch of forest as Leidisen Metsä, Lantonen's Woods. Hunters avoid camping there. They say you can still find trees with faint, shallow cuts, like someone marking a perimeter. In winter, when the wind moves through the pines, it makes a slow, rhythmic sound like with striking wood. The sound carries farther than it should, and sometimes, according to those who still walk the old paths, it stops abruptly, as if someone is listening. Detroit, 1932. The city was in its worst winter in decades. Snow piled high in the alleys between burned-out row houses, and the factories of Highland Park coughed black smoke into a sky already heavy with it. The Depression had cut through the city like a dull knife. Layoffs, hunger, evictions, and by December, whole families were living in their cars. That was the winter the hatchet killings began. The first body was found on the east side, in a derelict house on Chain Street. The police called it an accident at first, a vagrant found frozen, slumped against a wall. But the morgue report noted something odd, a single, deep wound behind the left ear, clean and straight, as though made by a blade rather than a fall. A week later, another body turned up near the Grand Trunk Railroad yard. Same wound, same precision. By the third killing, the papers had a name for him, the Detroit Hatchet Man. The victims had nothing in common. A day laborer, a woman known for selling newspapers on Gresham Avenue, a boy of 14. But each was found near the riverfront, near the dark edge of the city where the factories met the shanty towns. Always struck from behind, always left in the open, as if arranged. It was Detective Henry Mallory who first noticed the pattern. He was a veteran of the Homicide Bureau, a man more at home in taverns than in the station, with a soft voice that carried weight in a room. He spent nights walking the slush-filled alleys of the east side with a flask in his coat and a notepad in his hand. Mallory believed the killer was not transient. The clean strike of the hatchet, the lack of hesitation, it looked practiced. Someone used to chopping, he told the papers. A butcher or a mill worker. Maybe both. By February, there were 7 dead. The city began locking its doors at dusk. Men with no homes slept in the police station just to avoid the streets. Patrol cars started circling the riverfront every hour. But the killer kept moving, sometimes striking 2 or 3 nights apart, as if watching the police respond and moving faster than they could. One night, a night watchman at the Packard plant reported hearing a dragging sound near the freight entrance. When he opened the door, a man in a dark coat and cap was pulling what looked like a burlap sack. The watchman called out, but the man bolted into the shadows. Inside the sack was a severed hand. Police canvassed the area for days. They questioned butchers, carpenters, and even gravediggers. But no one in the neighborhood saw anything, or said they had. The cold, the poverty, and the fear made everyone quiet. Then, on March 9th, the killing stopped. For almost 2 months, the police found nothing. No bodies, no signs, no rumors. Then came the fire. In April, a row of old wood frame houses near Jefferson Avenue went up in flames. When the smoke cleared, firefighters found the charred remains of 2 men inside. One burned beyond recognition, the other with a hatchet embedded in his skull. The unburned body was identified as John Kepner, a 38-year-old slaughterhouse worker. He'd lived alone, kept to himself, and had been fired weeks earlier for erratic behavior. His co-workers told police he often talked to himself, muttering about voices in the walls. Inside his home, investigators found a blood-stained overcoat, several newspaper clippings about the killings, and, in a locked chest, a collection of human teeth carefully cleaned and labeled by date. It looked like the case was solved. The papers declared Kepner the hatchet man, a madman driven by poverty and delirium. His death in the fire was treated as the end of it. But Mallory wasn't convinced. The teeth were all from victims killed before February, none from the last 2. And the style of the final 2 murders had changed. Cleaner, faster, almost surgical. For weeks, Mallory revisited the burned ruins, picking through the ashes long after the press had lost interest. Behind a collapsed wall, he found something the fire hadn't touched. A hatchet head, its handle long gone, its blade rusted dark. Inside the metal, stamped faintly near the edge, were 2 initials, RM. There were no records of anyone named RM connected to Kepner. That spring, the killing stopped entirely. The case faded into police folklore, a grim relic of the Depression. The file was closed in 1933, marked solved, though no one could say for certain what had happened in the final weeks. But 30 years later, in 1963, when a new housing development broke ground on the east side, workers uncovered a shallow pit behind the old Packard plant. Inside were 3 skeletons, each with a fractured skull. Buried with them was another hatchet, identical to the first, its initials the same, RM. No records could trace where it came from or who owned it. The manufacturer had gone out of business decades earlier. The bones were reburied quietly, and the discovery was never officially connected to the old case. Still, some of the older officers in the department used to tell rookies a story, that in certain parts of Detroit, late at night, you could hear a metallic tapping in the alleys near Jefferson, like a blade being tested against brick. Armstrong, British Columbia, sits in the northern Okanagan Valley, a farming town surrounded by fields, hills, and the slow silence of rural Canada. In autumn, the leaves turn rust-colored and cling to the edges of the narrow roads. By late October, the sky feels lower, the air thin with cold. In 2011, it was the kind of place where doors were still left unlocked and kids still walked home after dark. On Halloween night that year, 18-year-old Taylor Van Diest left her home on Pleasant Valley Road just before 7. She was dressed as a zombie, fake blood on her cheek, torn shirt, heavy eyeliner that made her eyes look dark and sunken. She texted her boyfriend, Colby, saying she was on her way to meet him by the railway tracks that cut through the center of town. The walk took only 15 minutes. She never arrived. Around 8:30 p.m., her parents began calling her phone. No answer. By 9 o'clock, they drove the short route themselves, headlights sweeping over the gravel path near the tracks. They found nothing. No sign of her, no dropped bag, no movement in the fields. It wasn't until later that night, around 10:30, that a passing motorist noticed something beside the embankment near Rosedale Avenue, a shape lying against the dirt, half hidden by brush. Taylor was found barely conscious, her head bleeding, throat marked with deep bruises. Her costume was torn. She had been struck several times and strangled, but she was still breathing when paramedics arrived. She was rushed to Vernon Jubilee Hospital, where she died the next morning without regaining consciousness. News of her death spread quickly through Armstrong. The town had never seen a killing like it. The RCMP set up roadblocks, searched fields, and went door to door asking residents if they'd seen anything unusual that night. Most hadn't, but a few people reported hearing screams near the railway line between 7:30 and 8 p.m. Others recalled a man walking alone through the area earlier that evening. Hooded, hands in pockets, head down. Investigators recovered Taylor's cell phone near the tracks. The screen was cracked, the text message she'd tried to send frozen in the outbox, being followed. Forensic teams combed the scene. They found DNA on Taylor's jacket collar. Male, not in the national database. Fibers on her costume matched those from a dark-colored hoodie. There were no witnesses, no security cameras, and no clear motive. The only certainty was that whoever had attacked her had done so quickly and deliberately, choosing a stretch of path barely lit by a single street lamp. The murder shook the town in ways that felt impossible for such a small place. Parents began driving their children everywhere. The walking path by the tracks, once a simple shortcut, became a landmark no one used. Posters with Taylor's photo hung in store windows and on telephone poles. Her wide smile, dark hair, and the date of her death printed underneath. Weeks passed, then months. The investigation continued quietly. In early 2012, the RCMP announced that DNA from the Taylor Van Diest case had matched a sample from an unsolved assault in Kelowna 4 years earlier. In that incident, a woman had been attacked near a lakefront walkway and managed to fight off her assailant. The attacker had fled, leaving behind traces of blood. That DNA was now confirmed to be the same man. The connection changed everything. Armstrong's small-town tragedy was no longer isolated. It was part of a wider pattern. By spring, the RCMP had narrowed their suspect list to a few men with past records in the region. One name surfaced repeatedly: Matthew Forster, a 26-year-old from Cherryville, a nearby community. He had minor criminal history, break-ins, theft, but nothing violent. Still, his vehicle matched one seen in the area that Halloween night, and phone records placed him within a few kilometers of the crime scene. In April 2012, after months of surveillance, police arrested Forster at a motel in Ontario, more than 3,000 kilometers from Armstrong. He offered no resistance. When questioned, he claimed he had never met Taylor Van Diest, but the DNA was irrefutable. His genetic profile matched the sample from her jacket and later from beneath her fingernails. During the search of his family's home, investigators found clothing that appeared to have been recently washed but stained faintly with blood. In his first interviews, Forster's demeanor was calm, detached, even polite. When asked why he was in Armstrong that night, he said he'd gone for a drive to clear his head. He couldn't explain why his DNA was on the victim. Later, when confronted with the evidence, he changed his story. He said he'd only grabbed her, that the attack got out of hand. The autopsy told a different story. Taylor had been struck multiple times in the head, possibly with a flashlight or blunt object. The ligature marks on her neck suggested prolonged force. Forensic pathologists determined she had fought back, clawing at her attacker's face and arms. At trial, prosecutors described the killing as predatory. They played audio from Forster's police interviews, in which his voice remained steady even as he recounted the night. The defense argued impulsivity, that he panicked after a confrontation turned violent. But the preparation, the concealment, the attempt to clean evidence afterward all told a colder story. Forster was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole for 25 years. His father, Stephen Forster, was later convicted as an accessory for helping him evade arrest. Even with the conviction, Armstrong never truly returned to what had been. The path near the railway was eventually fenced off. A memorial bench was placed beside the bridge where Taylor had been found, marked simply with her name and the year. Each Halloween since, locals have placed candles there, hundreds of tiny flames lining the road. Taylor's friends still talk about her laughter, her plans to study music in Vancouver, her sketches that filled the walls of her bedroom. Her mother keeps her costume folded in a box, never washed, still faintly stained with the makeup she wore that night. For Minnie and Armstrong, the case ended officially with the trial, but something lingered. The image of the text message, being followed, stayed in public memory, passed around online, and printed in articles, frozen in that last moment between ordinary life and the unthinkable. Years later, in interviews, investigators admitted that the case changed the way small towns in British Columbia approached violent crime. It had proven that brutality could happen anywhere, even on streets where everyone knew your name. But among those who live near the railway path, a quieter detail endures, not from reports, but from the people who still walk home after dark. They say that on late autumn nights, near the bend where the brush grows thick, cell signals sometimes flicker. Messages fail to send, and for a moment, before the reception returns, the world feels as still and heavy as that October evening. The town has grown since then. New houses, new lights, new families who never knew her. But the path remains. And if you stop there even briefly, you can still see the faint outline of cross in the dirt where the bench stands. A single mark for an 18-year-old who never made it home. Durban, South Africa. Early 2010s. In the humid sprawl of KwaZulu-Natal's largest coastal city, carnival masks were a common sight in the summer markets. Cheap, bright, and unsettlingly lifelike. Street vendors sold them by the hundreds near the beachfront arcades and along the Golden Mile. No one thought much of them until people started dying. The first body appeared on March 14, 2012, in a parking lot behind a petrol station in Umbolo. A young taxi driver named Manlakoza had been found slumped in the driver's seat of his Toyota Quantum, engine still running, window shattered. He had been shot once in the head at close range. CCTV footage showed only a figure in a clown mask approaching the taxi moments before the attack. Bright orange hair, red lips, blank eyes, and then walking calmly away. Police dismissed it as a robbery gone wrong. Durban had no shortage of violent crime, and masks were nothing unusual. But then it happened again. 2 weeks later, a woman named Sibinjal Masiko was shot while closing up her hair salon in the same district. Witnesses saw a man in a clown mask cross the street, pull a small revolver, and fire twice before vanishing into the night. No attempt to steal money. No sign of a getaway vehicle. By the time the third murder occurred, the newspapers had a name for him, the Durban Clown. Panic spread fast. Parents refused to let their children walk home from school. Party shops stopped selling clown masks altogether. Radio stations broadcast curfews, urging people to stay indoors after dark. Each attack came without warning. Random victims, public places, always one clean shot to the head. Police investigators found shell casings from the same .38 caliber weapon at every scene. The killings continued through April and May. 6 confirmed victims, all within a few kilometers of one another. The city's police commissioner called it a targeted campaign of terror. Detective Ravi Pillay, a veteran of Durban's organized crime unit, took over the case. He noticed a strange pattern in the timing. Every shooting occurred between 8:45 and 9:15 p.m. on weekdays only. It suggested someone who worked regular hours, someone disciplined. The footage, though grainy, showed the same mask each time, not store-bought but altered. The paint had been stripped from the eyes, leaving 2 dark holes that looked hollow and sunken. Then in June, the killing stopped. For 2 months, nothing. No clown sightings, no new bodies. Police assumed the killer had fled or died. Until August 2nd. That night, a university student, Thabo Mthethwa, was walking home through Berea when he noticed someone following him. A tall figure in a dark raincoat, wearing what looked like a clown's mask. The figure didn't speak, just kept pace, staying a few steps behind. Thabo ran. When he reached his building, he turned once, just long enough to see the clown raise a finger to its lips. The next morning, Tabo's neighbor found a small plastic bag hanging from his doorknob. Inside, a single spent bullet casing and a folded note that read simply, 7. Police increased patrols, but by then, fear had taken root in the city. Posters went up at bus terminals. Do not approach masked individuals. Report immediately. Some residents claimed to see the clown standing on street corners late at night, motionless, watching traffic lights change. Detective Pillay was sure it was more than one person. The shootings were too widespread, the precision too consistent. He suspected a vigilante group or a criminal faction using the costume to spread chaos. But there was no evidence of organization, no claims, no ransom, no manifesto. Then came the breakthrough. In September 2013, police arrested Saifo Dlamini, a former security guard, after he tried to pawn a revolver that matched the ballistics from the first killings. When they searched his home, they found 2 clown masks, one burned at the edges, the other still stained with something dark. Under interrogation, Dlamini said he didn't act alone. He named 2 other men, the twins, he called them, known in the underworld for contract work and extortion. He said the 3 of them had been hired to send a message to taxi drivers and shop owners who refused to pay protection money. When asked who had hired them, Dlamini refused to speak. He just kept repeating the same phrase in Zulu. He still wears the mask. Before he could stand trial, Dlamini was found dead in his cell, hanged with a length of bedsheet. No one saw it happen. The twins were never found. By 2014, the killings had stopped completely. The case went cold, but the clown sightings didn't. Over the next few years, Durban police logged dozens of calls from residents claiming to see masked figures near construction sites, abandoned malls, or empty lots. Each report was the same. The clown never spoke, never approached, just stood and watched until the witness left. The last confirmed report came in 2018 from a security guard patrolling a shuttered amusement park outside Umlotsi. He told officers he saw someone sitting on a broken carousel horse at 3 a.m., a clown mask hanging loose around their neck. When the guard called out, the figure turned slowly toward him and smiled. By the time he reached for his flashlight, the carousel was empty. That same night, a message appeared on a now-defunct local forum dedicated to unsolved South African crimes. The post contained no username, no timestamp, just a few words. Durban sleeps. The circus doesn't. It was deleted within the hour. To this day, no one knows who really started the killings, whether it was a gang, a lone shooter, or was something else entirely. In the late 1960s, the quiet college town of Ypsilanti, Michigan, was a place caught between 2 worlds, the sleepy calm of small-town life and the restless energy of the nearby universities. Eastern Michigan University dominated much of the landscape. Red brick dormitories, football fields, coffee shops, and the faint hum of student life that carried into every street. But between 1967 and 1969, that hum was replaced by something darker, a quiet, tightening fear. It began with a single body. On a warm July morning in 1967, a 19-year-old student named Mary Flesser was found near a deserted farm off LaForge Road. Her body was badly decomposed, lying face down in tall grass. She had been stabbed repeatedly and mutilated. Her clothes were torn, her shoes missing. A local farmer's dog had discovered her remains. Police struggled to find leads. There were no witnesses, no clear suspect, only the sense that whoever had done it had taken his time. The brutality was personal, precise. The newspapers called it one of the most savage crimes in the county's history. A year later, another girl vanished. This time, it was 20-year-old Joan Schell, a student at Eastern Michigan. On the night of June 30th, 1968, she was hitchhiking back to her apartment after visiting friends. She was last seen getting into a light-colored car driven by a young man. Her roommate remembered his face, handsome, long hair, polite. 5 days later, Joan's body was found in a field near North Territorial Road. She had been stabbed 47 times. Investigators noticed something chilling. Her clothes were arranged neatly beside her, and her hands were placed across her chest as though posed. Panic spread through Ypsilanti. The two murders, both young women, both students, both killed in summer. The pattern was clear, and it was only beginning. Police formed a joint task force with the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office, while university staff warned students not to walk alone after dark. In March 1969, a 23-year-old graduate student named Jane Mixer disappeared. She'd posted a note on the campus rideshare board, looking for a lift to Muskegon to visit her family. She was found the next morning at a remote cemetery outside Ann Arbor. She had been shot once in the head and strangled with a nylon stocking. Her body was covered with her own raincoat, and her killer had placed a copy of Catch 22 beside her. It seemed almost deliberate, as if he wanted to be seen, but only through his arrangement of the dead. Detectives began connecting the dots. Young women, mostly students, all attacked within a 15-mile radius. The killer's method changed, but his pattern of control, the staging of the bodies, was unmistakable. Over the next months, the killings accelerated. April 1969, another woman, 13-year-old Dawn Baysom, abducted while walking home from a friend's house. Her body was found near the Huron River, strangled with an electrical cord. Bits of adhesive tape were still stuck to her wrists. June, 21-year-old Alice Callum, an art student, found beaten and stabbed behind an abandoned farmhouse. July, 18-year-old Karen Sue Bainman, last seen alive at a downtown wig shop on Washtenaw Avenue. The clerk remembered her leaving with a man on a motorcycle, clean-cut, friendly, dressed in khaki and boots. She was found 3 days later beneath a pile of branches near Ypsilanti Creek. She'd been strangled with her own tights. Her killer had washed her body and carefully placed her sandals beside her. The town went into lockdown. For 2 years, the killer had moved through the streets unseen, stalking, abducting, killing, disappearing into the same calm darkness each time. Police began calling him the co-ed killer. The press preferred the Ypsilanti Ripper. Detective John Collins of the state police led the investigation. He was meticulous, methodical, but the evidence came slowly. The break came not from forensics, but from coincidence. When Karen Bayman's body was found, police canvassed the last place she'd been seen alive, the wig shop. The clerk remembered the man clearly, a regular customer named John Norman Collins. Collins was 22, a student at Eastern Michigan, studying education. He lived on Emmett Street, not far from campus. Clean-cut, athletic, polite, the kind of person no one suspected. Detectives visited his apartment. Inside, they found strands of hair matching the victim's, flecks of blood on the basement floor, and a piece of cloth identical to one found near her body. When questioned, Collins denied everything, claiming he had spent that night with his girlfriend. But his alibi didn't hold. Forensic testing, limited at the time, connected fibers from Collins's home to multiple victims. A neighbor also recalled seeing his motorcycle parked outside on the night Bayman disappeared. Police began linking him to the earlier murders through circumstantial details, phone records, overlapping social circles, matching injuries, and similar staging of the bodies. One witness, a university student, claimed Collins had once asked her to pose for photographs in the woods, promising it would be like an art project. She declined. When Collins was finally arrested in July 1969, he seemed almost indifferent. During interrogation, he spoke calmly, smiling at times, denying all involvement. Detectives described him as eerily composed, as if he were waiting for them to tire out. At trial, prosecutors focused on the Bainman case, the only one with direct physical evidence. They presented fibers, hair samples, witness testimony, and the strange, careful nature of the crime scenes. Collins's defense team tried to argue contamination, coincidence, character assassination. But the pattern was too precise to ignore. In August 1970, John Norman Collins was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Though convicted for only one murder, police were confident he was responsible for at least 7. The rest of the cases were left officially unsolved, but in the years that followed, they were quietly filed away under the same classification, connected to the Ypsilanti series. After Collins's imprisonment, the killings stopped. Even so, a few details never sat right with investigators. The variation in method, knife, strangulation, firearm, suggested either a developing killer experimenting over time or more than one person. A few officers believed that Collins had help, perhaps another student, someone who shared his fascination with control and death. But without evidence, the theory faded. Decades later, forensic advances re-examined the DNA from one of the earlier victims, Jane Mixer. The results excluded Collins entirely. The match pointed instead to a man who had been a child at the time of her death, his DNA present through accidental contamination years later. The finding didn't free Collins, but it blurred the edges of the narrative. In Ypsilanti, the memory never fully disappeared. Older residents still recall that summer of fear, the police sirens, the nightly curfews, the posters urging women not to walk alone. The wooded backroads where the bodies have been found are now lined with new housing, but the ground is the same. Every few years, someone revisits the case in a local documentary or a student film. The same images appear, the grainy photographs of Collins, the yellowed police maps with red pins marking each body. What never changes are the spaces between them, the small gaps of forest, the silent fields, the unlit roads where he stopped and where no one heard. Vladivostok, 1996. The city stood at the edge of Russia's far east like a forgotten port, half sunk in fog and diesel fumes. After the fall of the Soviet Union, everything there seemed to come apart at once. The economy, the factories, the law. The docks were overrun with smugglers. The police were underpaid and corrupt. It was the kind of place where people disappeared quietly and no one asked why. In the autumn of that year, they began finding what was left of them. The first discovery came from a fisherman near the old shipyard. A burlap sack floated up against the rocks. Inside were human remains, partial, cleanly dismembered, each wrapped in newspaper pages dated the same week. A crude attempt had been made to burn the contents, but the cold sea had stopped the fire. Within a month, 3 more sacks appeared, all in roughly the same area. The remains belonged to different people. None of them reported missing. Each corpse had been cut apart with frightening precision, as if by someone who understood anatomy. The local papers didn't print the story. By then, Vladivostok was used to bad news. The case only reached the authorities' attention when a retired police captain, Sergei Drobyshev, took it upon himself to investigate. He was one of the old guard, methodical, disciplined, still keeping his uniform pressed even though his salary hadn't been paid in months. He began by tracing the newspaper used to wrap the remains. All the pages came from the same issue of Dalnovostoknaya Pravda, a small regional publication printed in limited numbers. The distribution list led him to a vendor's stall in the Central Market. The vendor remembered selling that specific bundle to a woman, mid-30s, dark hair, polite, carrying a cloth shopping bag. She bought 6 copies. It was the first lead. By winter, the killings had escalated. Construction workers found a suitcase buried under the snow behind an abandoned building near the outskirts of the city. Inside were more remains, 2 sets this time, male and female. Autopsies showed that the victims had been alive when the dismemberment began. The brutality of the acts, paired with the surgical precision of the cuts, left investigators convinced they were dealing with at least 2 perpetrators. One physically strong, the other skilled with a blade. Rumors spread through the city. Some said it was the mafia, making examples of their debtors. Others whispered about a husband and wife team who ran a small kiosk near the train station. Their names were Yuri and Marina Petrov. They lived in a 2-room flat above their shop, selling cigarettes, bread, and vodka. Locals described them as quiet, withdrawn, and strangely synchronized, moving together, finishing each other's sentences. Marina had once been a nurse before losing her job when the hospital shut down. Yuri had worked at the docks, unloading cargo. In early 1997, Drobyshev began watching them. He noticed that every Thursday night, long after closing, Yuri would carry heavy bundles down to their basement. Marina always followed, locking the door behind her. On February 19th, police raided the property. What they found below the floorboards stunned even the most seasoned officers. Dozens of blood-stained rags, surgical knives, and, in a small freezer unit against the wall, fragments of human remains, cleanly cut, labeled in plastic bags with dates. In a corner of the basement was a ledger. Each page listed a name, age, and note in Marina's handwriting: paid, owes, returned. The couple didn't resist arrest. When questioned, they spoke calmly, often together, as though rehearsed. Marina said they had begun killing in 1995, targeting drifters and alcoholics who came to their kiosk. They offered cheap vodka, mixed with sedatives, waited until the victims passed out, then used them. When asked why, Yuri only smiled. "We didn't waste anything," he said. The press dubbed them the Axe Couple, though the weapon they favored was actually a heavy butcher's cleaver. The name stuck. During the trial, Marina appeared detached, often gazing out the window as evidence was read aloud. She admitted to preparing the victims for clean disposal, but insisted that Yuri did most of the cutting. She claimed he had developed an obsession with purification, that he believed the city was rotten, and they were helping to cleanse it. Yuri never denied the charges. When asked if he felt remorse, he replied, "No, they were already dead inside. We just finished what life started." The court convicted both of them on 17 counts of murder, though investigators believed the true number was far higher. They were sentenced to life imprisonment. Yuri in a penal colony near Magadan, Marina in a women's facility outside Irkutsk. 2 years later, Yuri was found dead in his cell, throat cut with a smuggled blade. Marina lived another decade. She refused all interviews, speaking to no one except her lawyer. In 2008, she reportedly stopped eating altogether and died within weeks. After their deaths, their old apartment in Vladivostok remained empty for years. Eventually, the building was renovated and divided into offices. Workers claimed that when they removed the basement floorboards, they found faint stains that wouldn't wash away. One caretaker, who stayed late to finish repairs, said he kept hearing something from below, a slow, deliberate chopping sound, steady as a metronome. When he checked, the basement was empty. But the sound, he said, followed him home that night. In 2016, a group of local true crime enthusiasts visited the site, filming a short documentary. In the footage, one of them holds up a rusted blade found in the dirt near the foundation. Etched faintly into the handle are 2 letters, MP. They hadn't told the public her maiden name. It began quietly, on the morning of September 29, 1982. Chicago was just waking up, the city moving through its usual rhythm. The hum of traffic, the chill of early autumn, the gray haze that settled over the suburbs. No one noticed that in a modest home in Elk Grove Village, a 12-year-old girl named Mary Kellerman had just taken a capsule of extra-strength Tylenol for a cold. Within minutes, she collapsed to the floor of her bathroom. Her parents heard the sound of her body hitting the tiles. At the hospital, doctors worked to revive her, but she was already gone. The cause of death wasn't clear. There was no trauma, no overdose, no apparent reason. They called it a sudden medical mystery, and the body was sent for autopsy. That same morning, in another suburb 20 miles away, a man named Adam Janis left work early, complaining of chest tightness. He was 31 years old, a postal worker, and otherwise healthy. After seeing his doctor, he went home to rest. He took 2 Tylenol capsules from a recently purchased bottle and sat down in his living room chair. Moments later, his wife and brother heard him gasp. He slumped sideways, unresponsive. By that afternoon, he was dead. The Janis family gathered at the house to mourn. The coroner suggested a heart attack, but the symptoms were odd: rapid collapse followed by cyanosis. As relatives filled the kitchen, Adam's younger brother, Stanley, reached for the same Tylenol bottle. He took 2 capsules for a stress headache. His wife, Teresa, did the same. Within the hour, both were on the floor. Paramedics rushed them to the hospital, the same one where Adam's body had just been pronounced. The emergency room staff, recognizing the surname, assumed grief or coincidence. When Stanley and Teresa arrived in critical condition, doctors began to realize something larger was happening, but it was too late. Both were declared dead before midnight. 3 people from one family all within hours. The next morning, the phones began ringing across Chicago's northwest suburbs: Arlington Heights, Lombard, Winfield. 3 more cases surfaced: a stewardess named Paula Prince, a new mother named Mary Reiner, a homemaker named Mary McFarland. Each one had died suddenly, without struggle, all within the same 24-hour window. All had taken Tylenol. Investigators from the Illinois Department of Public Health converged on hospitals. They began collecting the pill bottles from the victims' homes, examining expiration dates and lot numbers. The capsules looked normal, white powder sealed inside translucent gelatin shells. But when they were tested, the results came back unmistakable: potassium cyanide, enough to kill a horse in a single dose. The discovery sent a shock through the medical community. Cyanide wasn't something you could accidentally find in consumer medicine. It was a deliberate choice, a chemical used in mining, jewelry, and industrial cleaning, known for its speed and silence. Within seconds of ingestion, it shuts down cellular respiration, suffocating the body from the inside out. The city's pharmacies emptied overnight. Police cars patrolled store parking lots. Helicopters circled overhead as investigators swept through hundreds of shelves, removing every bottle of extra-strength Tylenol in the Chicago area. By October 1st, Johnson & Johnson issued an emergency recall, not just in Illinois, but nationwide. 31 million bottles, worth over $100 million, were pulled from shelves. Television anchors warned viewers not to take any capsules, no matter the brand. Supermarkets locked up their pharmaceutical aisles. In the morgue, technicians worked under harsh fluorescent light, lining up the recovered capsules in rows. They glowed faintly pink under the lab lamp, a trace left by the cyanide compound. Someone had tampered with them by hand, likely after they were distributed. Each bottle came from different manufacturing plants, meaning the poison wasn't introduced at the factory. It was local. Someone was driving from pharmacy to pharmacy, opening bottles, replacing a few capsules, then sealing them back up. The killer left no fingerprints, no witnesses, no pattern beyond randomness and proximity. The bottles were found across a 20-mile radius: grocery stores, corner pharmacies, even a drug counter at an airport terminal. On October 5th, the last known victim, flight attendant Paula Prince, was discovered in her Chicago apartment. She had been found by coworkers who noticed she hadn't shown up for her flight. Her purse was still on the table. Next to it sat a recently purchased bottle of Tylenol, the safety seal torn open. Security footage later showed her buying it from a Walgreens on North Avenue, a still image of her smiling faintly at the cashier, unaware she was holding a death sentence in her hand. Her body was found with the same chemical scent investigators were beginning to recognize: bitter almonds, faint but distinct. The media called it product terrorism, a phrase that had never existed before. The idea that anyone could contaminate a common household medicine sent ripples of paranoia through the country. Stores began adding tamper-proof seals. Laws changed. Packaging was redesigned overnight: foil barriers, shrink-wrapped lids, warning labels. The case, though, never found its culprit. In early October, a man named James Lewis from New York sent a letter to Johnson & Johnson, demanding $1 million to stop the killings. His return address was fake, but fingerprints led police to him within days. When they arrested him, they discovered the letter had been a hoax, an extortion attempt exploiting the murders. He was sentenced for attempted blackmail, not murder. Lewis denied any involvement in the poisonings. There was no cyanide in his possession, no direct link to the stores. Decades later, he would maintain his innocence until his death. Hundreds of suspects were questioned, including pharmacists, delivery drivers, and even members of the victims' families. None matched the pattern. The investigation became one of the largest in FBI history, spanning years and thousands of interviews. The trail, however, was sterile. The contaminated bottles had been purchased randomly. No cameras, no fingerprints, no residue beyond the poison itself. Whoever did it had moved quickly and cleanly. In time, the story faded from headlines, but the fear never quite left. The government mandated tamper-evident packaging across all over-the-counter medicines. Pharmacists began checking seals before stocking. The capsule, once common, was gradually replaced by caplets, solid and harder to manipulate. The victims' families received condolences, settlements, and a kind of quiet legacy. Their deaths had forced the nation to change. Still, somewhere in the archives of the Chicago Police Department, in a brown evidence box marked 1982, Tylenol, there remain 7 photographs, the faces of those who died, preserved beside the empty capsules that killed them. They were buried in different cemeteries, in separate towns, but their deaths were connected by a single, invisible hand. The hand of someone who walked calmly down an aisle, lifted a bottle from a shelf, and turned a moment of ordinary illness into one of the most inexplicable mass murders in American history. No one ever saw them enter or leave, and no one ever found them. Halloween night, 1984. San Bernardino, California. The kind of small desert city where the heat never fully fades, even in October, where the streets shimmer under orange streetlights and the air carries the smell of dust, asphalt, and cheap candy. That year, the holiday fell on a Wednesday. Kids were out in cheap costumes, plastic masks of Freddy Krueger, Dracula, skeletons, running from house to house before curfew. Most of the adults stayed indoors, watching horror marathons on TV or hosting small neighborhood parties. At 10:22 p.m., the first 911 call came in. A woman's voice, frantic, barely coherent. "There's blood. Everywhere. They're all dead." The dispatcher tried to get an address, but the call cut off. A minute later, another came through from the same block, this time from a teenage boy, saying he'd seen people sprawled all over a driveway, Halloween decorations mixed with real blood. When police arrived at the Ortega residence on Redstone Avenue, they thought it was a prank. The porch was covered in fake cobwebs and flickering orange lights. A life-size scarecrow hung from a noose by the mailbox had tilted to the side. It wasn't until one of the officers stepped closer that he realized the scarecrow's hands were bound behind its back, and that the mask was real skin. Inside the house, the scene was pure horror. 9 people were dead, 3 adults, 6 teenagers, all in costume. The victims had been attending a Halloween gathering hosted by the Ortega family. The party had started around 8 p.m., and according to neighbors, laughter and music carried through the open windows. Then, sometime after 9:30, the noise stopped. What police walked into was a silence, so heavy it felt staged. Each victim had been killed differently. Some shot, some stabbed, one drowned in the kitchen sink. There were signs of struggle, but no forced entry. Whoever had done it had been invited in. The only survivor was a 7-year-old girl, the Ortega's daughter, who'd hidden inside a toy chest. When officers found her hours later, she was shaking uncontrollably, unable to speak. It took 3 days before she said anything at all. What she described didn't sound like a single killer. It sounded like 2. A man in a devil mask, she said, and a woman with white hair. The man, she said, had carried a long, black gun and spoke in a calm, soft voice. The woman never spoke, only walked through the house slowly, touching the victims before they died. No fingerprints, no forced entry, no clear motive. The police had little to go on until they found the car. About 5 miles away, behind a shut-down bowling alley, a black 1976 Pontiac Bonneville was discovered abandoned. The plates were removed, but the trunk held a duffel bag filled with Halloween props, latex gloves, fake blood, and a devil mask. DNA testing in the 1980s was primitive, but investigators found traces of real blood on the fabric lining the mask. That blood matched several of the victims. The case sent shockwaves across California. The press dubbed it the Halloween Massacre, while tabloids printed wild theories. Cult involvement, satanic rituals, escaped mental patients. But the most unsettling theory came from one of the detectives, Lieutenant Richard Morano, who had a reputation for noticing patterns. 2 years earlier, on October 31st, 1982, a nearly identical murder had occurred in Barstow, 60 miles away. Same MO, multiple victims, party setting, killer in costume. That case had never been solved. Morano began to suspect a traveling pair, a man and woman who appeared each Halloween, killed in one town, then disappeared without trace. He was right about the pattern. He just didn't live to see it proven. In 1987, a triple homicide in Needles, California, was linked by ballistics to the same .32 caliber used in the San Bernardino murders. A neighbor saw a car speeding away that night, a black Pontiac, older model with one headlight out. By 1988, the FBI was involved, classifying the killers as a nomadic duo, likely partners or lovers. Sketches were distributed nationwide, showing a tall man with a narrow face and a woman with prematurely white or silver hair. They were suspected in at least 4 Halloween night massacres between 1982 and 1988, totaling over 30 victims. Then nothing. No further killings, no sightings, no arrests. The case went cold for decades, until a DNA match surfaced in 2010. Forensic testing of an old cigarette, but found in the Ortega house, matched a sample from a woman named Marilyn Crane, who had died in a Las Vegas nursing home in 2005. Crane had a long record of mental illness and a string of aliases. She had once been married to a man named Edward Eddie Lasco, a drifter, carnival worker, and Vietnam veteran who vanished in 1989. Police reopened the case, but with both suspects dead, there was little left to solve. The remaining mystery was motive. Crane's medical records revealed something chilling. In the months before her death, she repeatedly spoke to nurses about the nights of cleansing, insisting that the masks made them invisible. When asked who they were, she would whisper, "Eddie and me. We were chosen." Forensic analysis later confirmed Lasco's fingerprints on one of the shell casings from 1984, finally linking him beyond doubt. The case was closed in 2012, though officially marked as solved by identification only. But not everyone accepted that. One of the surviving San Bernardino officers, now retired, told a local journalist in 2020 that he still visits the Ortega house every Halloween. It's been renovated, repainted, its past mostly forgotten. Yet, each year on October 31st, he swears the front porch light flickers 3 times, even though the house's new owners keep the power shut off during the night to avoid pranksters. He says the light blinks out, then back on, in the same rhythm the dispatcher heard 36 years ago, just before the line went dead. Stanford University, October 12, 1974. The air was cool and dry, the kind of early autumn night when the campus seemed to glow under the orange lamps. Students were spilling out of dorms in costumes and light jackets, walking toward fraternity parties and small gatherings. It was a Saturday night before midterms, the kind of night meant for noise, beer, and music. But at around 11:30 p.m., in the stiller corner of campus, a young woman named Arliss Perry walked alone toward the Stanford Memorial Church. She was 19, recently married to a sophomore pre-med student named Bruce Perry. They'd met in Bismarck, North Dakota, a quiet, devout couple who had moved to California only a few months earlier. Arliss was the kind of person who wrote letters home every week, who volunteered at church events, who still spoke softly even when excited. That night, the Perrys had argued. It wasn't serious, nothing that would have raised alarm among their friends. Something about car tires or errands undone. Bruce went to fill the tires with air at a nearby service station. Arliss said she wanted to go pray. It was past 11 when she left the dorm, wearing a beige jacket and carrying a small Bible. The Stanford Memorial Church was one of the few buildings open late. Inside, the air was cold and faintly perfumed with candle wax. The campus security guard on duty that night, Stephen Crawford, saw her enter the building alone a little after midnight. She nodded politely when he greeted her. Crawford would later say there were 2 other people praying inside at the time, both of whom left shortly after. Around 12:10 a.m., he locked up the main doors for the night. He didn't see Arliss leave. When Bruce returned to the dorm around 12:30 a.m., Arliss wasn't there. He assumed she was still at the chapel. He waited half an hour, then went to look for her. The church doors were locked. He tried knocking, but there was no sound. By 3 a.m., he called campus security. The guard on duty, the same Stephen Crawford, assured him the building was secure and empty. By morning, she still hadn't returned. At 5:45 a.m., Crawford unlocked the main door to begin his morning rounds. As he pushed the heavy wooden door open, he felt a resistance, something wedged behind it. When he looked down, he saw the body of a young woman lying on her back, blocking the entrance. It was Arliss Perry. Her head was tilted toward the altar. Her arms were extended outward, positioned deliberately. Her clothing had been disturbed, and a candle, one of the heavy altar candles from the sanctuary, had been inserted in a way that left little doubt the act was meant to desecrate. Another candle had been placed across her chest. The scene was cold, silent, and meticulously staged. The first officers to arrive that morning described the church as unnaturally still, the smell of wax thick in the air. There were no signs of forced entry. Every door was locked from the inside. The killer had either hidden inside before it was locked or possessed a key. Crawford told police he'd found the body just minutes earlier. His demeanor was calm. He provided a clear timeline of the previous night, the people he'd seen, the rounds he'd done, the hours between closing and discovery. The detectives noted his composure, but saw no immediate reason for suspicion. The coroner's report confirmed what the scene had suggested. Arliss had been struck on the head with a blunt object, likely a candlestick, and then asphyxiated. The ritualistic posing came afterward. Her husband, Bruce, was questioned extensively. He was young, visibly shattered, and had an alibi confirmed by the gas station attendant. No evidence connected him to the murder. In the days that followed, Stanford became an armed campus. Reporters gathered near the chapel gates. Theories spread: cult involvement, satanic ritual, campus stalkers. Police combed through the university's student files, searching for anyone with a history of violence or obsession with religion. Nothing. There were no fingerprints on the candles, no blood traces outside the immediate area, no sign of how the killer escaped. Dogs brought in to track scent lost it near the rear door, one of the exits that could be opened from the inside, even while locked from outside. The university locked the church for months. When it finally reopened, the staff had replaced the candles and polished the marble. Students still avoided the pew where she had been found. For years, the case haunted both the campus and the local police. Every few years, new detectives would re-examine it, hoping DNA technology could fill the gaps. Each time, the evidence degraded a little more. In the 1980s, a wave of satanic panic led to renewed interest. Some speculated that Arliss, a devout Christian, had been targeted by a cult trying to mock her faith. Others tied the killing to the son of Sam Letters, a stretch of logic based on a single mention of a girl slain in a church in California. The FBI investigated the connection and dismissed it. Bruce Perry eventually left California, pursued psychiatry, and built a career helping trauma victims. He spoke rarely of his first wife. The years rolled by. The case sat in cold storage. Photos, fibers, fingerprints, DNA samples too damaged to test. Then, in 2018, Stanford police announced a breakthrough. New forensic methods had isolated a DNA profile from the scene, a partial match found on Arliss's clothing. The sample was run through databases. It pointed back to one man, Stephen Crawford, the campus security guard who had found her body. Crawford was 72, living quietly in a condominium in San Jose. Detectives obtained a warrant. On June 28, 2018, they arrived at his door to serve it. When they knocked, Crawford didn't answer. They called his name through the window. Moments later, they heard a muffled pop from inside. By the time they entered, he was slumped on his couch, a revolver in his lap. He had taken his own life before they could question him. In his apartment, investigators found items that had once been considered missing from the chapel evidence inventory: photographs, newspaper clippings, even a small box marked Arliss P., containing handwritten notes about the investigation. DNA testing confirmed the link. Crawford's genetic material matched the sample found on the victim's clothing. The case was closed after 44 years. No motive was ever confirmed. Crawford had no known history of violence. He had worked security for decades, living an unremarkable life in the same region where the crime occurred. When Stanford's Memorial Church held its next service, the priest paused before the altar where Arliss had been found. The candles were burning again, white wax dripping silently down the brass holders. Outside, the October air was cool, the same dry chill as the night she died. And for the first time in 4 decades, the lights inside the chapel stayed on through the night. In the mid-1970s, Georgetown, Penang, was a humid mix of colonial decay and growing tourism. The streets near the harbor smelled of salt, diesel, and spice. Rickshaws clattered along cobblestones under rusting street lamps, and vendors stayed out late selling grilled satay and rice wrapped in banana leaves. It was a city that slept in fragments, especially in the red light district off Stewart Lane, where the working girls, sailors, and drunks mingled until dawn. It was there, between the narrow alleys behind the old shop houses, that the killings began. The first body appeared on June 9, 1974. A young woman, believed to be in her 20s, was found in a drainage ditch behind a textile shop. Her throat had been cut cleanly, but there were strange precision marks along her ribs, almost surgical. Locals said she was a time migrant, known only by her nickname Lena. There were no witnesses, no sign of struggle, and no blood trail leading to where she lay. The papers barely mentioned it. A prostitute murdered in the backstreets wasn't unusual enough for the Penang Gazette. But when the second woman was found, 2 weeks later, in almost the same position, the city started to pay attention. Her name was Ng Po Lin, a seamstress who lived above a tailor shop. Her abdomen had been opened neatly, organs removed and placed beside her. Whoever had done it knew anatomy. Police sealed off the area, but the night markets continued as usual. Vendors sold noodles while officers searched the drains. By the end of July, there were 5 victims. All women, all killed with a sharp blade, all found within a 1-kilometer radius of the harbor. Rumors spread fast. Some said it was a foreign sailor. Others whispered about a butcher who supplied meat to the nearby food stalls. The tabloids began calling him the Butcher of Penang. It was only when the 6th victim was discovered that the investigation broke open. Not because of who she was, but because of where she was found. She was a medical student, last seen leaving the University of Malaya's Penang campus. Her body was discovered behind a seafood market, her wounds matching the others. For the first time, the victims no longer fit one social type. It wasn't about class or occupation anymore. It was geography. The police formed a task force of 12 officers. Their focus turned to the Lebu Campbell Market, where a man named Lim Chi Hong ran a popular butcher stall. Lim was quiet, middle-aged, always polite to his customers. He'd worked there for nearly 15 years. His knives were famously sharp, his cuts immaculate. When detectives first questioned him, he was cooperative. He admitted he'd seen some of the victims. They were regulars, he said, buying meat or scraps for their cats. Nothing more. But one officer, Sergeant Tan, noticed something strange. Lim's stall was spotless, yet beneath the drain grate near his counter was a dark stain that wouldn't wash away. Samples were taken. Under ultraviolet light, the residue tested positive for human blood. Police obtained a warrant to search Lim's home in Air Item. Inside his small 2-room house, they found surgical tools, scalpels, bone saws, glass jars filled with preservative fluid. Lim claimed he collected medical curiosities. In his backyard, buried beneath a row of banana trees, they found bones. Some animal, some human. Lim was arrested on August 18, 1974. During questioning, he remained calm. He denied everything, insisting the bones were old and that his jars came from the market's trash. But on the 3rd night of interrogation, when officers left him alone in the holding room, Lim began talking to himself. A guard overheard fragments of the conversation. Lim seemed to be addressing someone he called Ame. He whispered that she was still hungry and that he hadn't finished cleaning. When police asked who Ame was, Lim refused to answer. It wasn't until investigators searched his mother's house in Bukit Mertajam that they found the truth, a faded photograph of a girl in a school uniform, dated 1959. On the back, written in ink, Ame, 15 years old. Records showed she had disappeared that same year. She was Lim's younger sister. Neighbors remembered the story. The girl had gone missing after walking home from school. Her body was never found. The family quietly moved to Penang soon after. Lim was charged with 6 counts of murder, though police suspected the real number was higher. His trial in 1975 drew national attention. Journalists described him as soft-spoken, almost gentle. In court, he often smiled at the prosecutors, as if the proceedings were an inconvenience. When asked directly if he killed the women, he replied, "I only helped them leave their bodies. The rest was her work." He never clarified who her was, but his defense attorney argued mental illness. The judge rejected the plea, citing Lim's careful planning and concealment of evidence. He was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging at Taiping prison. 2 days before his execution, Lim requested a bowl of white rice, a cup of tea, and a small mirror. Guards later said he spent hours staring into the reflection, whispering softly in Hokkien. When asked what he was saying, he told them, "She's almost here." On the morning of February 12, 1976, he was hanged. His body was cremated, ashes buried in an unmarked grave near Butterworth. For years, the story faded into local legend. But in 1998, during renovation of an old meat market off Stewart Lane, workers found a hidden compartment beneath one of the drains. Inside were several glass jars, identical to the ones Lim had owned, containing preserved organs and teeth. No one claimed them. The police report was filed quietly, never reopened. Today, the site is a modern food court. Tourists eat noodles under bright fluorescent lights, never knowing that the tiled floor once covered the drains where the Butcher of Penang worked. But every few months, the cleaners report the same thing. The drains clog, always with something thick, black, and sticky. They clear it out, bleach the tiles, and it returns weeks later. The maintenance logs show the first report appeared on February 12th, the anniversary of Lim's execution. And in one log entry, written by a cleaner in 2017, there's a single note beside the date. Strange smell again. Like iron. Like something freshly cut. Paris, 1927. The city was still shaking off the scars of the Great War. Rebuilding, repainting, pretending to forget. The cafes of Montmartre were alive again. Painters, poets, and night workers sharing the same narrow streets beneath the soft gaslight glow. The air was thick with smoke, perfume, and the faint tang of iron from the butcher shops that lined Rue Lepic and Rue des Abysses. It was a district that never really slept. By day, the market stalls were loud and bright. The sound of cleavers on cutting boards, horses' hooves on wet cobblestones, vendors calling out prices for lamb and veal. But by night, Montmartre belonged to the shadows. Prostitutes, drunks, and the artists who never made enough to leave. And sometime that winter, a man began moving through those shadows. The first discovery came in late January, behind a cafe called Le Lapin-Gris. A garbage collector noticed a small wooden crate among the refuse, heavier than the rest. When he pried it open, he found what he thought was a side of pork wrapped in brown butcher paper. It wasn't. It was a woman's torso, cleanly separated at the waist, the flesh carefully washed and packed as if for storage. Police cordoned off the alley and brought lanterns. The snow was falling in soft, colorless sheets. There were no footprints, no blood trail, nothing to indicate where the rest of the body had gone. 2 days later, another crate was found, this one near the Pigalle Metro entrance. Inside, arms, wrapped in wax paper stamped with the red insignia of Boucherie Giraud, a local shop on Rue de Trois Frères. Detectives arrived at the butcher shop before dawn. The owner, a pale, middle-aged man named Etienne Giraud, opened the door without protest. He had been in business for 20 years. His knives were clean, his apron pressed. He showed them his logbook, his receipts, his records of meat deliveries. Everything in order. Still, the wax paper matched. Giraud told police anyone could have taken some from the delivery area behind his shop. The rolls were left near the alley, waiting for collection each morning. He claimed to know nothing about the murders. His composure never faltered. The Paris press named the killer Le Boucher de Montmartre, the Butcher of Montmartre. The nickname spread fast, printed in block letters across every newspaper. The city loved a story like this, gruesome, local, and mysterious. But detectives didn't. They knew how quickly panic could breed in the maze of tenements that wound up the hill from Boulevard de Clichy. Over the next 6 weeks, the discoveries continued. A leg found floating in the Seine near Pont de l'Alma. A hand wrapped in oilcloth behind the Moulin Rouge. Always clean cuts, precise, practiced. The killer used tools sharper than a kitchen knife. Someone trained, deliberate. The morgue filled with journalists and gawkers. Police photographers arranged the remains in careful order for identification. Women came in daily, factory workers, dancers, maids, searching for faces or marks they recognized. One of them, a laundress named Colette Martin, identified a small birthmark on one of the recovered arms. It belonged, she said, to her friend and co-worker, a young woman named Amy Delatour. Amy was 23. She lived alone in a rented room off Rue de Martyrs. She hadn't been seen since New Year's Eve. Neighbors recalled hearing a man's voice from her flat that night, followed by the sound of furniture being moved. No one thought much of it at the time. It was Montmartre, and noise was constant. Detectives searched Amy's apartment. The bedding was gone. A small bloodstain was visible beneath the rug. No signs of struggle beyond that. But near the window, they found a single butcher's hook, small and worn, hanging from a nail, as if forgotten. The pattern was becoming harder to ignore. Police brought in every butcher in the district for questioning. Most were older men, tradesmen with dull eyes and thick hands. One, however, stood out, a younger assistant from the Rue Lepic market named Henri Vidal. He was 29, quiet, unmarried. He lived in a small attic room above his shop. Colleagues described him as polite but distant, the kind of man who preferred closing shifts when he could work alone. He was known for his precision with the cleaver, his care in trimming meat. When police searched his room, they found little: a few shirts, a shaving kit, a stack of newspapers detailing the murders. Nothing incriminating. But beneath the bed, inside a wooden crate, was a pair of women's shoes, caked in dry blood. Vidal claimed he'd found them behind the shop and kept them because they were in good condition. The shoes matched the size and make of those owned by Amy Delatour. He was arrested the same day, but denied everything. Without witnesses, and without a body beyond the partial remains, the court hesitated. The evidence was circumstantial, strong enough for suspicion, not for conviction. After 3 months in custody, Vidal was released. The killing stopped immediately afterward. Montmartre returned to its usual rhythm. The laughter in the bars, the painted girls in doorways, the sound of accordion music echoing from open windows. The case faded into legend. Vidal left Paris soon after his release. Some said he moved south to Marseille or Lyon. Others claimed he'd gone to Belgium. Officially, his trail ended in 1930, but the story didn't. In 1933, a new series of murders struck the port city of Antwerp. Dismembered women, butchered cleanly and wrapped in wax paper. The Belgian police noted the similarities to the Paris case, but could find no connection. The press resurrected the old name, Luc Boucher de Montmartre. Whether it was the same man, no one ever proved. The original case file in Paris was sealed during the war and misplaced during the occupation. When archivists reopened it decades later, many of the photos were missing. Only one remained, a blurred black and white image of the first crate, the wax paper peeled back, the initials D written faintly on the inside flap. In the lower corner of the photograph, behind the body, stood a narrow shadow, cast across the wall by the gaslight. The silhouette of a man holding a cleaver. No name, no record, just the faint suggestion that someone else had been in that alley when the police arrived. To this day, no one knows who took that picture.